The steam engine hissed, a monstrous iron beast breathing out its life onto the parched air of Prosper, Kansas. The town was little more than a scar on the prairie, a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled against the railroad tracks as if for warmth. Dust, fine as milled flour, coated everything: the water trough, the lethargic dog sleeping on the boardwalk, and the man who stood waiting. Elias Thorne watched the passengers spill out. He was not a man built for towns. He was tall and broad, shaped by labor, not comfort. His clothes were worn denim and flannel, washed to a pale, uniform blue, smelling of soap and horse sweat. He had ridden 3 days to be here, and his eyes, clear and gray as a winter sky, scanned the crowd with a dispassionate patience. He was not looking for a woman. He was looking for cargo. The last of the passengers had claimed their baggage and scattered, vanishing into the land office or the dry goods store. Only the station master, a harried man with ink stains on his cuffs, remained at his desk inside the small depot. Elias stepped inside, his boot heels echoing on the wooden floor. The station master, Mr. Hames, looked up, his expression shifting from annoyance to a kind of greasy curiosity. "Thorne," Hames said, nodding. "She arrived?" Elias said nothing. He simply waited. "A bit of paperwork," Hames muttered, pulling a thick ledger toward him. He fumbled with a pen, dipped it, and scratched an entry. "The agency in St. Louis wired the particulars. You are to take possession of a Miss Ruth Barrow." He looked up, his eyes watery. "The final fee is due on collection." Elias reached into the pocket of his denims. His hand emerged and placed a single coin on the worn desktop. It was a silver dollar. "Mr." Hames stared at the coin. He looked back at Elias, his mouth slightly open. The silence in the small office stretched, broken only by the click of the telegraph key from the next room. $1. Not the usual 20 or 50 for a healthy, vetted bride. $1 was what a man paid for damaged goods, for a guarantee of nothing. "Mr. Thorne," Hames began, his voice lowered. "The agency fee is—" "That is what was agreed," Elias stated. His voice was low and rough, like stones dragging. It was not a voice for arguing. It was a voice for ending arguments. Hames swallowed. He had heard of Elias Thorne. The man kept to himself up in the high hills, a place where only coyotes and hard luck thrived. He was not a man to cross. The station master quickly dipped his pen again and scribbled a "paid" next to the entry. He snapped the ledger shut. "She is on the platform," he said, avoiding Elias's gaze. "The one left." Elias turned without a word and walked back out into the blinding white sunlight. She was exactly where Hames had said, a lone figure at the far end of the platform, next to a pile of unclaimed freight. She was small and seemed to be trying to make herself smaller, drawing her thin shoulders inward. She wore a dark, heavy traveling dress, unsuitable for the Kansas heat, and a plain bonnet that shadowed her face. In her gloved hands, she clutched a single, battered carpet bag. As Elias approached, she did not look up. She seemed to be studying the warped wood of the platform at her feet. She was shaking, not a violent tremor, but a fine, deep vibration, as if a cold wind blew only on her. He stopped a few feet in front of her. He was a large man, and his shadow fell over her, offering a momentary, unwanted relief from the sun. She flinched at the shadow, but did not move. "Miss Barrow," he said. It was not a question. She raised her head slowly. The bonnet had hidden it, but it could not hide it completely. The left side of her face, from her cheekbone to her jaw, was a map of mottled purple and yellow, a dark, ugly bruise, already a few days old. Her skin was pale, her lips chapped and bloodless, but it was her eyes that held him for a beat. They were wide and dark, and in them, he saw an animal caught in a trap, so terrified it had forgotten how to fight. waiting only for the killing blow. She was fighting tears, but they were losing the battle. One spilled over, tracing a clean line through the dust on her unbruised cheek before she quickly, angrily, wiped it away. Her body was stiff, braced for an impact. Elias looked at the bruise. He looked at the single bag. He saw the way her knuckles were white from gripping the handle. The train whistle shrieked, preparing for its journey further west, and the sound seemed to shatter something inside her. A memory, sharp and cold, cut through the haze of her terror. She was not on a train platform. She was in her uncle's study back in Philadelphia. The room smelled of old leather and cigar smoke, a place of immense, suffocating wealth. Her uncle, William, stood by the fireplace, his face rigid with a fury that was colder than any fire. "You have become a liability. Ruth," he had said, his voice clipped. An embarrassment, a stain. She had stood where she was standing now, stiff, silent, her hands clasped. First, the whispers about that. Artist. Then, your condition. And now, this disgrace. He had waved a hand, dismissing her, dismissing the life that had briefly and ruinously grown inside her. A life that was now gone, leaving only scandal in its wake. She had been foolish. She had trusted a man's sweet words and promises of art and freedom. And when the consequences became clear, the man had vanished. "No decent family will have you," her uncle continued. "You are ruined, damaged." She remembered the feel of the carpet under her shoes. She remembered the physician he had brought, a grim man with cold hands who confirmed her return to availability, as he had phrased it. "I have found a solution," William had said. "A man on the frontier, a rancher. He has agreed to take you, to remove this burden from my house." He had thrown the train ticket onto the desk. She had tried to protest, to beg. She had families, cousins. "No one wants you," he snapped. And when she had wept, when she had pleaded for mercy, his patience had broken. His hand, heavy with a gold ring, had struck her face. A single brutal blow that sent her stumbling back. "You will go," he had hissed, his face close to hers. "You will get on that train, and you will never, ever use my name again. You are no longer a barrow. You are nothing." The train whistle blew again, pulling her back to the dusty platform. Elias Thorne had not moved. He had watched the memory flicker across her bruised face. He had seen the shame, the terror, and the final, crushing resignation. He did not ask about the bruise. He did not ask why she was alone. He did not ask what she had done to be sent here. To him, for the price of a single silver coin. He simply gave a short, stiff nod. He reached down and took the carpet bag from her grasp. Her fingers were locked so tightly that he had to pull gently to free it. The bag was heavier than it looked. He hefted it easily and turned, walking toward the street. Ruth stood frozen for a second. This was it. The transaction was complete. She was bought. She took a shuddering breath, tasting the grit in the air, and followed the broad back of the man who owned her. His wagon was a simple buckboard, hitched to two sturdy mules that looked as weary and tough as the land itself. The wagon bed was loaded with sacks of flour, oats, and a new barrel. He tossed her bag onto the pile and then motioned to the wooden seat at the front. She hesitated, her hands clutching her skirts. He did not offer to help her up. He simply waited. Using the iron step, she pulled herself onto the seat, her limbs clumsy with dread. The wooden bench was hard and sun-baked. Elias climbed up beside her, the wagon dipping under his weight. He took the reins, clicked his tongue, and the mules lurched forward. The wagon wheels groaned as they rolled out of Prosper, leaving the noise and the judgment of the town behind. They rode in silence. The town vanished behind them, swallowed by the rolling, empty plains. There was no road, only a faint track that Elias seemed to follow from memory. The world was vast, an ocean of dry, yellow grass under a sky so big it threatened to swallow them whole. The only sound was the rhythmic plodding of the mules, the squeak of the wagon's axle, and the incessant, sighing wind. Ruth sat rigid, her hands clasped in her lap. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, on the place where the pale blue sky met the brown earth. Hours passed. The sun climbed to its peak, beating down on them without mercy. The heat baked her dark dress, and sweat trickled down her back. But she did not move. She did not ask for water. She did not dare to speak. She waited. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind for 1,000 miles. Her uncle had sold her. This man had bought her. She knew what was expected. She was here to pay a debt, to serve a purpose. The men in town had looked at her with hungry, knowing eyes. This man, this silent rancher, had paid $1 for her. He would want his money's worth. The waiting was worse than the act itself. The silence stretched her nerves thin, making them scream. Every jolt of the wagon, every glance from the man beside her, though he never glanced at her, was a new terror. The sun began its long descent, painting the western sky in bruised colors of orange and purple. The air grew cooler, but the chill did not touch the fever of her fear. She could not bear it any longer. The dread was a physical thing, choking her. She had to break the silence. She had to get it over with. She turned her head just slightly toward him, though she could not bring herself to look at his face. She stared at the rough flannel of his sleeve. Her voice, when it came, was a dry, cracked whisper. "Please." He did not turn. His gaze remained fixed on the mules, on the track ahead. She swallowed the dust in her throat and tried again, forcing the words out. "Whatever you mean to do, please, just do it fast." She closed her eyes, her whole body tensing, waiting for his hand, his voice, his anger. Elias Thorne did not reply. He did not slow the mules. He did not acknowledge her words in any way. He just kept driving, his profile unmoving as the wagon rolled deeper into the growing shadows of the hills. Her shame was so profound it was almost a numbness. He had not even bothered to answer. She was so worthless that her plea meant nothing. She turned her face away, a hot, silent tear cutting another path through the grime on her cheek. It was full dark when they finally arrived. The wagon crested a high ridge, and she saw it below them, a single, dark shape against the prairie. It was not a ranch house. It was a cabin, small and hunched, looking as if it had grown out underscore of the earth rather than been built upon it. It was the loneliest place she had ever seen. Elias guided the mules to a small barn, unhitched them, and led them inside. He returned to the wagon. "Bring your bag," he said, and walked toward the cabin. Ruth fumbled for her carpet bag, her limbs stiff and sore from the long ride. She climbed down, her legs shaking, and followed him to the door. He pushed it open. It scraped against the floor. He stepped inside and struck a match, lighting a kerosene lamp on a small table. The yellow light flared, pushing the darkness into the corners. The cabin was one room. It was stark and cold. A cast-iron stove stood against one wall, its pipe black with soot. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat in the center. In the far corner was a bed, a simple wooden frame with a thin, straw-tick mattress. Against the opposite wall was a dry sink with a bucket of water. There were no curtains on the single window. There were no pictures on the walls. There were no rugs on the floor. And there were no mirrors. There was not a single piece of glass in which she could see her own reflection. Elias set a sack of flour down by the stove. He turned to her. She was standing just inside the doorway, clutching her bag to her chest like a shield. He did not move toward her. He stood by the table, his shadow looming large on the log wall behind him. "This is my home, Miss Barrow," he said. His voice was flat. "The contract is simple. I will provide you with shelter. I will provide you with food. You will not go cold, and you will not go hungry." He paused, his gray eyes meeting hers in the lamplight. She saw the bruise on her face reflected in his gaze. "In return," he continued, "you will work. You will cook the meals. You will mend my clothes. You will keep this house." He motioned to the bed in the corner. "That is yours. I sleep by the hearth." Ruth stared at him, her mind struggling to understand. He spoke of mending clothes and cooking, not of the other things. He spoke of her as a housekeeper, not a wife. He had given her the bed. She was so tired. She was so broken. She could only nod, a jerky, numb movement. I understand," she managed to say. He seemed to accept this. He took a heavy blanket from a chest at the foot of her bed and tossed it onto the floor near the cold fireplace. He took off his hat and set it on the table. "There is water in the bucket," he said. "The outhouse is behind the barn." And with that, he turned his back to her, sat on the floor, and began to pull off his heavy boots. The conversation, it seemed, was over. Ruth did not move for a long time. She watched this strange, silent man prepare for sleep as if she were not even there. He was ignoring her. After everything. After the $1. After the long, terrifying ride. He was simply ignoring her. She felt a confusion so deep it momentarily displaced her fear. She had believed she was there only to be used. She had braced herself for a night of brutality. But this was just emptiness. Slowly, she moved to the bed. She did not undress. She was too cold, too afraid. She laid her carpetbag on the floor and sat on the edge of the mattress. It crackled under her weight. It smelled faintly of dust and straw. Elias finished with his boots, lay down on the floor with his back to her, and pulled the blanket over his shoulders. Within minutes, his breathing evened out. Ruth sat in the dim light, listening. The wind howled outside, a high, mournful sound that pressed against the little cabin. It was the only sound she had ever heard that sounded as lonely as she felt. Far off, a pack of coyotes began to yip and cry, their voices sharp and wild. She finally lay down, pulling her feet up onto the thin mattress. She curled onto her side, facing the log wall. She was still wearing her bonnet. She did not have the strength to untie it. She was safe, for tonight she was not being cherished, but she was not being hurt. It was a cold, empty mercy, but it was more than she had expected. She thought of her uncle's house, of the soft beds and the thick carpets, and the violent, suffocating judgment. She thought of the dollar coin that had defined her value. A single sob, hot and painful, broke from her chest. She jammed her glove into her mouth to stifle the sound. She would not make a noise. She would not let him hear her. She cried into the rough wool, her body shaking silently, until the cold and the exhaustion finally pulled her under, into a dark, dreamless sleep. Across the room, Elias Thorne was not asleep. He lay staring at the cold, dark stones of the hearth. The fire was out, but he did not need its light. He had been awake in this darkness for 5 years. The wind moaned, and the coyotes sang their song of hunger. His hand, rough and calloused, moved to his chest, beneath his shirt. He felt the familiar, smooth shape against his skin. He drew it out, a simple, thin gold wedding ring, hanging on a leather cord around his neck. He closed his fist around it, the metal cutting into his palm. He held it tightly, his jaw set as he listened to the faint, muffled sounds of the woman crying in his bed. He stared into the darkness, his face a mask of old, cold grief, and waited for the dawn. The light that woke Ruth was not the gentle, filtered light of her memories. It was a cold, gray, unforgiving blade that cut through the single unwashed window and laid bare the poverty of the room. She was stiff, her bones aching from the thin mattress. For a moment, she did not know where she was. Then the smell reached her, old wood smoke, dust, and the faint animal scent of the man sleeping on the floor. Elias Thorne, her owner. Her eyes darted to the hearth. He was already gone. The blanket he had used was folded into a neat, severe square on the floor. The cabin was empty, freezing cold, and silent. A wave of panic seized her. He had left her. He had abandoned her in this desolate place. She scrambled off the bed, her bruised face throbbing in the cold air. She ran to the door, pulled it open, and stumbled outside. The world was vast and empty. The ranch was not a ranch. It was a hovel sitting in the lap of an enormous, empty bowl of brown grass. The hills rolled away in every direction, barren and windswept. There was no other house, no road, no sign of life anywhere. The wind was the only living thing, and it never stopped moving, pulling at her thin nightdress, slicing through the fabric. She saw him. He was by the structure she now realized was a barn, pumping water from a well into a trough. The two mules drank deeply. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy. Every action necessary, nothing wasted. He did not look at her. She was not abandoned. She was simply irrelevant. Ruth retreated into the cabin, her teeth chattering. Her duty. He had given her a duty. She looked at the cast-iron stove. It was a black, cold beast. Back home, fires were lit by servants. The coal brought in bins. She had never made a fire in her life. She found matches in a tin. She found a few slivers of wood in a box. She fed them into the stove, struck a match, and watched as a feeble flame licked the wood and then died in a puff of smoke. She tried again and again. Tears of frustration and incompetence stung her eyes. She was still trying when Elias entered. He carried an armload of split logs. He did not speak. He walked past her, set the wood down, and knelt by the stove. He brushed her failed attempts aside, laid a foundation of dry tinder she had not seen, arranged the kindling, and struck a single match. The fire caught, roared, and settled. He stood. "There is coffee in the tin, bacon in the sack. The skillet is clean." He left again, disappearing into the cold morning. Ruth cooked. She learned. The next morning, she had the fire lit before he returned, though it took her half an hour and most of the matches. Her life shrank to the four walls of the cabin and the small patch of beaten earth outside. She tried to find a place in the rhythm of the household. She swept the floor, but the fine dust of the prairie seeped back in as soon as she was done. She boiled water, scrubbing his heavy denim trousers and flannel shirts on a washboard until her knuckles were raw. She found his mending basket. The clothes were torn, the buttons missing, the seams frayed. She sat for hours by the window, her needle flashing, patching up the wounds in his clothing. She was a ghost in his home. They existed around each other, two silent bodies orbiting the cold stove. He would rise before dawn and be gone. He would return at dusk, eat the meal she had prepared, usually beans, bacon, and hard biscuits, and then sit by the fire. He would clean his rifle, or oil his tack, his hands busy. He never spoke unless it was a direction. "The flour is low. The mules need shoeing." He never, ever looked at her for more than a second. She was a tool he had acquired, and as long as she performed her function, she was left alone. The land itself was hard. The prairie grass was dry. The earth cracked. Winter was not waiting its turn. It was settling in early, riding on a wind that had a new, sharp edge. The nights grew colder, the frost thicker. Ruth watched the wood supply by the door shrink day by day. Elias seemed to notice it too, his eyes lingering on the pile each evening. One afternoon, she was frying salt pork for the evening meal. The skillet was old, the fire in the stove too hot. She was clumsy, tired, and the hot grease popped. A sudden, violent spray of scalding liquid. It struck the back of her hand. Ruth cried out, a sharp, stifled sound, and dropped the fork. She clutched her hand to her chest, biting her lip to keep from screaming. The pain was white-hot, searing. She had been taught to be silent, to endure. She turned her back to the door, hoping he had not heard, and ran her hand under the cold water in the dry sink. The silence behind her was absolute. She knew he was there. She heard his heavy boots on the floor. She flinched, bracing herself, expecting a curse for her carelessness, for wasting time, for ruining the food. He said nothing. He simply took her arm, his grip firm. He turned her gently toward the light. He looked at the burn. It was an angry red, already blistering. His face was unreadable. He let go of her arm and went to a small shelf. He took down a tin of axle grease, looked at it, and put it back. He opened a small wooden box and took out a different tin, this one smelling of pine and herbs. He also retrieved a roll of clean, white cloth, torn from an old shirt. He motioned to the table. "Sit!" She obeyed, trembling. He sat opposite her, took her injured hand, and laid it palm down on the table. His hands were immense, calloused, and stained with dirt and oil. They were the hands of a man who broke things for a living. He opened the tin of salve and dipped his fingers in. His touch, when it came, was so careful it made her gasp. He did not rub. He dabbed the cool, soothing balm onto the burn, his movements precise, impossibly gentle. Her skin was screaming, but his touch did not add to the pain. She watched his bent head, the rough cut of his hair, the lines of concentration around his eyes. He was focused on the task, on the wound, as if it were a piece of leather he was tooling. He wrapped the cloth around her hand, not too tight, and tied it with a neat, simple knot. He finished. He did not pat her hand. He did not offer a word of comfort. He simply released her, put the tin and the cloth away, and returned to the skillet. He finished cooking the salt pork. Ruth sat at the table, staring at her bandaged hand. She was trembling, not from the pain, but from the shock. He had not been kind. Kindness was soft. He had not been cruel. Cruelty was expected. He had been careful. It was a neutrality so profound it frightened her more than anger would have. A week later, the supplies were too low to ignore. Elias hitched the mules to the buckboard. "We are going to town," he said. Fear, cold and immediate, flooded her stomach. "I can stay." "I need feed and salt. You need to choose the cloth for Mips. Your dress is tearing." It was true. Her traveling dress was her only garment, and it was falling apart. He was not asking. He was stating a fact. She climbed onto the wagon seat, her bandaged hand hidden in her lap. The ride was silent, as always, but this time, she was acutely aware of him beside her, the man who had touched her wound. Prosper was just as she remembered it, dusty and mean. Elias hitched the wagon in front of the general store. The few men lingering on the boardwalk stopped talking. They watched Elias climb down. Then they watched Ruth. Their eyes were hungry. They knew. "I will get the feed," Elias said, ignoring them. "The store is there." He left her. He walked to the feed store as if he were alone, his strides long and confident. Ruth sat frozen on the wagon seat. The men were watching her. She could feel their stares like physical hands, pulling at her clothes, assessing her. She saw one of them whisper to another, and the second man laughed. She had to get down. She had to do her job. She slid off the seat, her legs unsteady. She kept her head down, her eyes on the filthy boardwalk, and walked toward the store's entrance. The bell above the door tinkled. The store, which had been buzzing with conversation, fell dead silent. Mr. Hames, the station master, was at the counter, talking to the proprietor. He saw her and his face tightened. Two women, dressed in their dark, respectable town clothes, were at a barrel of calico. They looked up, saw her face, saw the bruise that was now a sickly yellow, and then looked at each other. One of them, a stout woman with a face like a sour apple, deliberately turned her back, pulling her skirts aside as if Ruth were carrying a plague. Ruth felt the blood rush to her face, a hot tide of shame. She walked to the counter, her hands clasped. I need thread," she whispered. The proprietor, a thin man with a stained apron, looked past her, toward the door. Elias Thorne paying? Yes, sir. He slapped a spool of black thread on the counter. 10 cents. I also need cloth for a dress. The man sighed, annoyed. He pointed to the barrel. Calico is there. Pick it. Ruth hurried over, desperate to finish. She fumbled with the bolts of fabric, her hands shaking. The two women moved to the far side of the store, whispering loudly enough for her to hear. That is her, the sour-faced one said, the dollar bride. Shameful, the other whispered back. Sent all the way from the east, utterly ruined, they say. Damaged goods. Heard she was, loose. That Thorne bought her for less than a pig. Ruth fisted the rough calico in her hand. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to be dust. She selected a plain, dark blue fabric, carried it to the counter, and waited as the proprietor measured it with agonizing slowness. She paid with the coin Elias had given her and turned to flee. The sour-faced woman was standing in her way. It was Mrs. Hames, the station master's wife. She looked Ruth up and down, her gaze lingering on the bruise. Her face was a mask of pious contempt. We are a God-fearing town, miss, the woman said, her voice loud in the silent store. We do not abide filth here. Before Ruth could move, the woman gathered spittle in her mouth and spat on the floorboards, directly at Ruth's feet. The act was so vile, so full of hate, that Ruth stopped breathing. She stared at the small, wet mark on the floor. She fled. She ran from the store, gasping, and scrambled onto the wagon, clutching her parcels. She stared straight ahead, tears burning her eyes, refusing to fall. Elias returned. He was loading a heavy sack of oats onto the back of the buckboard. A man, who had been part of the whispering group on the boardwalk, stumbled over. He was drunk, buoyed by liquid courage and the support of his friends. Hey, Thorne, the man yelled, grinning. That the one? That the dollar woman? Elias did not pause. He settled the sack. The man grew bolder, stepping closer. Tell us, Thorne, is she worth the price, or did they cheat you? Heard she ain't fresh. Elias turned. He did not speak. He moved one step, and his fist, hard as a sledgehammer, shot out. It was not a barroom brawl. It was a single, brutal, economic motion. The sound was a wet, solid crack. The man's head snapped back. He dropped to the street like a puppet with its strings cut, and did not move. The boardwalk was silent. The other men took a step back. Elias looked down at his knuckles. They were split and bleeding. He flexed his hand, then turned and loaded the last sack. He climbed onto the driver's seat. Get in, he said, though Ruth was already there. The ride home was a torture of silence. The wagon jolted and groaned. The wind howled. Ruth sat stiff as a board, her heart hammering against her ribs. She kept sneaking glances at his hand, at the blood drying on his knuckles. He had defended her. He had struck a man for her. Why? They reached the cabin in the dim, cold twilight. He unhitched the mules and tended to them, his movements as steady and deliberate as ever. Ruth went inside and began to build the fire, her mind racing. He came in, the cold clinging to him. He went to the water basin and began to wash the blood and grime from his hand. Ruth could not bear the silence. She had to know. She stood by the table, her new cloth clutched to her chest. Why? Her voice was barely a whisper. He paused, his hand in the water. Why did you do that? She asked, stronger this time. In town, that man. Elias finished washing. He picked up the rough towel and dried his hand, wincing as the cloth touched his raw knuckles. He did not turn to look at her. He stared at the black window, at his own faint reflection. No one, he said, his voice low and flat, deserves to be treated like a dog. He tossed the towel aside and went to sit by the fire. Ruth watched him, a profound confusion settling over her. He had not defended her honor. He had not defended her. He had defended a principle, It was the same careful, impersonal act as the bandaging. She was a thing, a creature, and his code did not allow for the mistreatment of creatures. That night, the new knowledge settled on her like a weight. He had bought her. He had fed her. He had defended her. He must want payment. She had misunderstood his silence. He was not ignoring her. He was waiting. He had been patient, letting her heal, letting her settle. Now, he had shown his claim on her in front of the whole town. She waited until the cabin was dark, save for the low orange glow of the fire. He was on his blanket, his back to her. His breathing was even. She rose from her bed. Her heart was a cold stone in her chest. This was it. This was the true price. She had been sold for this purpose. Her uncle's words came back. "You are ruined. You are a burden." She knelt beside him on the hard floor. She was shaking so badly she could hardly move. "Mr. Thorne," she whispered. He did not stir. She reached out a trembling hand and touched his shoulder. He went rigid, in one swift, silent motion. He was sitting up, facing her. His eyes were alert, gray stones in the dim light. "What is it?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. Ruth could not speak. She had no words for this. This was a transaction. She had to pay her due. She fumbled for the top button of her nightdress, her fingers clumsy and numb. "Mr. Thorne, I am ready to—" His hand shot out and gripped her wrist. Not hard, but with a strength that stopped her instantly. She froze, her eyes wide with terror, waiting for the anger. He looked at her hand on her dress, then at her face. His expression was not angry. It was not lustful. It was tired. A deep, weary sadness passed over his features. "No," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. He released her wrist. Not like that. He stood up, towering over her. He walked to the other side of the cabin, picked up his heavy coat, and wrapped it around his shoulders. He took his rifle from the wall. "The mules need checking," he said, and was gone, leaving the door open to the freezing night air. Ruth knelt on the floor, the cold wind washing over her. The shame was so total, so complete. It was like a death. She had offered the only thing she had left, the currency of her ruin, and it had been refused. She was not even worth that. She crawled back to her bed and curled up, her body shaking with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. The silence in the days that followed was a living thing. It was heavier than stone, colder than the wind. They did not speak. They did not look at each other. Ruth cooked. Elias worked. The tension in the small cabin was so thick she felt she might choke on it. Then the storm broke. It came from the north, a great dark wall of cloud that swallowed the prairie. The wind screamed, a high, thin wail that sounded human. Lightning split the sky, followed by claps of thunder so violent the cabin shook. Ruth was trying to cook, but the wind was driving smoke back down the chimney, filling the room. Elias was by the window, watching the sky, his face grim. Another crash of thunder, simultaneous with a flash of white light, shook the very foundations of the house. It was too much. It sounded like her uncle's voice. It sounded like the crack of his hand. It sounded like the world ending. Ruth dropped the spoon. She could not breathe. The walls were closing in. "I need air," she gasped. And before Elias could move, she unlatched the door and ran out into the tempest. The wind and rain hit her like a solid wall. She did not care. She ran, blinded by the storm and her own panic, seeking refuge. She stumbled into the barn, the only other structure, and collapsed into the hay, burying her face, her hands over her ears. She huddled in the darkness, shaking, as the storm raged around her. She did not know how long she sat there. The barn was loud, the wind shrieking through the cracks, the roof groaning. The barn door scraped open. A beam of yellow lantern light cut through the gloom. Elias stood there, soaked, his coat slick with rain. He held the lantern high. He saw her, huddled in the hay like a terrified animal. He walked over, his boots heavy on the packed earth. He stood over her. "This is not safe," he yelled over the wind. "The roof is weak." Ruth looked up at him, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes wild. The storm had broken something deep inside her. The terror of the night, the shame of the town, the humiliation of his rejection, it all burst forth. "Leave me!" she screamed. "I am nothing. I am filth." "Get up," he said, his voice hard. "No, he said he loved me," she cried, the words tearing out of her, confessing to the storm. "He was an artist. He said I was his muse. He spoke of art and freedom." She was sobbing now, great, heaving gasps. "But it was lies, all of it. And when I was with child, he was gone." Elias did not move. The lantern light was steady. "I lost the child," she whispered, the confession raw. "It was a sickness, but the rumors said I had killed it. They said I was a harlot." She clawed at the hay. "My uncle, he did not even look at me. He just wanted me gone. He sold me. He sold me like a broken plow. He sold me for $1. She collapsed, weeping into the hay, her body convulsing. "I am not worth even that. I am not worth anything." Elias stood in silence, the rain drumming on the roof, the wind howling. He watched her break. He watched the poison of her past pour out of her onto the floor of his barn. He waited until the worst of the sobs had subsided, until she was just a shivering, exhausted heap. He did not reach for her. He did not offer a hand. He just spoke, his voice quiet, but clear and steady under the noise of the storm. "You are safe here." Ruth looked up, her breath catching. "The house," he said. "Come." He offered his hand. It was not a gesture of comfort. It was a command to rise. She took it, her hand still wrapped in the bandage he had tied. His grip was strong, and he pulled her easily to her feet. He led her back through the driving rain, shielding her from the worst of the wind with his own body. Inside the cabin, the fire was burning low. The room was warm. Ruth stood dripping and shaking by the door. Elias did not look at her. He went to the fire, added a log, and stoked it until it blazed bright. He turned to the wooden chest at the foot of her bed, a chest she had never looked in. He lifted the lid. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy shawl of dark blue wool. It was finely woven, soft, and smelled of cedar. He walked to the chair by the fire and draped the shawl over it. "Get out of those wet clothes," he said, his back to her. "The fire is warm." He went to his own side of the room, sat on the floor with his back to her, and began to remove his wet boots. Ruth stared at the shawl. She slowly, numbly, shed her soaking dress and shift. She wrapped her cold body in the thick, dry wool. It was the softest, warmest thing she had felt in a year. She sat in the chair, pulling her knees to her chest, and huddled into its folds. She watched the man who had bought her. He lay down on his blanket, facing away from her, and pulled his own rough blanket up. She sat by the fire, wrapped in a stranger's warmth, and for the first time since she had left Philadelphia, the terrible shaking deep inside her finally, blessedly, stopped. The world turned hard and sharp. The wind, which had been a constant, sighing companion, now developed an edge, a bite that promised ice. The prairie grass faded from yellow to a brittle, lifeless brown. The days grew short, the light thin and gray. In the small, cold cabin, Ruth began to find a shape. Her life was no longer defined by the terror of the night before, but by the necessities of the morning ahead. Elias had brought back 4 scrawny chickens from Prosper, and Ruth had built them a small, clumsy coop from scrap wood. Every morning, she broke the ice in their water trough and scattered grain, her fingers numb, The small, clucking sounds were a comfort, a small heartbeat in the vast silence. She felt a strange, new sensation, usefulness. Elias had silently handed her a small, leather-bound ledger. Inside were columns of numbers, records of seed, feed, and the meager price he got for the few pelts he trapped. Her refined education, so useless in this world, had at least taught her sums. She began to keep his records, her neat, careful script a stark contrast to his rough scrawl. He would look over her entries, nod once, and hand the book back. It was a silent delegation of trust. Her hands, once soft, were now her tools. They were chapped, scarred from the burn, and calloused from the washboard, but they were strong. She learned to mend more than shirts. She learned to mend his harness, stitching the thick, oiled leather saddle straps with an awl and heavy waxed thread. It was difficult, painful work, but she knew its importance. A broken strap on the range was a disaster. When she finished a repair, she would hand the piece of tack to him, and he would test it, pulling it with all his strength. He would grunt, a small sound of approval, and that sound was more warming than the fire. They began to talk. It was not a conversation of hearts. It was a language of survival. The crushing silence that had defined their first weeks was replaced by a necessary, functional exchange. "The wind is from the north," he would state, looking at the sky. "It will snow before nightfall." "We are low on salt," she would reply, checking the larder. "The bay mule favors his left foreleg. I have mended the heavy blanket. The stitching will hold." They spoke of the weather, of the animals, of the dwindling woodpile. They spoke of food, but they never spoke of the night of the storm. They never spoke of her past. They never spoke of feelings. It was a careful, unmarked truce, a patch of solid ground they had found between their two vast, private sorrows. One morning, the air was painfully clear and cold. Ruth was feeding the chickens when she saw Elias saddle his horse. It was not a workday. He did not take the wagon or the mules. He rode out, not toward the range, but toward the high, wind-swept hill that marked the western edge of his property. It was a place he never went, a place of no value, holding no water and no graze. She watched him until he was a small, dark speck against the pale sky, and then he disappeared over the crest. A curiosity, an emotion she had not felt in a long time, pulled at her. She finished her chores, her mind on the lone rider. The house felt empty, hollow. After an hour, she pulled her shawl, Anna's shawl, tight around her shoulders and left the cabin. The walk was longer than she expected. The wind on the hill was brutal, tearing at her skirts, whipping her hair from its pins. She had to lean into it, her head down. The higher she climbed, the more the world spread out below her. The small, lonely cabin, the barn, the vast, brown emptiness that stretched to the curve of the earth. It was a view that made her feel like the smallest thing in God's creation. Near the crest, she found it. It was a small, fenced-off square, the wood of the fence gray and weathered. Inside was a single grave, marked by a simple wooden cross. The wind had scoured the lettering, but she could still read it. Anna Thorne, beloved wife, 1850-1868. Beside the marked grave, there was a smaller mound, a mound of stones, with no marker at all. Ruth stood, her hand over her mouth. The wind was the only sound, a high, thin wail that seemed to come from the grave itself. She felt a profound, aching sorrow for this woman she had never known. This Anna who had lived and died in the same cold, isolated cabin. She felt like an intruder, a trespasser on a grief that was not hers. She was turning to leave when she heard the sound of a horse. Elias was there, 10 yards away, sitting on his horse and watching her. His face was unreadable, carved from stone. Ruth's heart leaped into her throat. I am sorry," she stammered, pulling the shawl tighter, suddenly aware of what it was. I was I saw you ride this way. I should not have. He did not seem to hear her apology. He dismounted, his movement slow, and walked to the fence, his gaze fixed on the wooden cross. He did not look at her. She liked the view from here, he said, his voice flat, almost casual. It was the calmest, most terrifying sound she had ever heard. Ruth said nothing. She just waited, the wind tearing at her. 5 winters back, he said, speaking to the grave, not to her. This cabin was new then. We built it together. He paused, and for a long moment, Ruth thought he would say no more. A storm came, he continued, his voice perfectly level. Worse than the one we had, snow, high as the window. We were trapped for a week. No way to get to Prosper, no way to get the doctor. He touched the top rail of the fence. It was her time, for the baby. Ruth closed her eyes. I was all she had, he whispered, so low she almost missed it. I did what I could. I boiled the water. I held her hand. He looked at his own large, rough hands. But I was not enough. She bled. I could not make it stop. He turned his gaze to the small pile of rocks. The boy did not make it either. I buried them here, when the thaw came. He looked at Ruth then, his gray eyes empty of all light, all warmth. I have not let anyone close since. I will not. Ruth finally understood. The ring he wore on the chain, his silence, his solitude. The not like that when she had offered herself. He had not been rejecting her out of disgust. He had been protecting this. He was still married, bound to the ghost on the hill. She realized her own grief, her own shame, was not the only sorrow in this cabin. Her loss was a disgrace, a stain. His was a void, a hollow place where a life used to be. She was not the only broken person here. She nodded slowly, unable to speak. She turned and walked back down the hill, leaving him alone with his wife. That night, the silence at the dinner table was different. It was not the tense, empty silence of strangers. It was a heavy, shared silence, weighted with the knowledge of the 2 graves on the hill. They ate their meal of beans and cornbread. Elias stacked his plate. He did not sit by the fire. He went to a small, locked chest under his bunk, a chest she had never seen him open. He produced a key from his pocket, unlocked it, and pulled out a dark brown bottle of whiskey. He also took out 2 tin cups. He set them on the table. He poured 2 inches of the amber liquid into each cup. He pushed one across the table to her. It was an offering, an acknowledgement. Ruth looked at the cup. She had only ever had sips of sweet wine at celebrations. This was a man's drink. This was medicine. She picked up the cup, her hand steady. She looked him in the eye, and she drank. The liquid was fire. It seared a path down her throat and exploded in her stomach. A sudden, blossoming warmth that spread through her chest and out to her numb fingers. She coughed, a small, sharp bark. Elias watched her, and a flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, passed across his face. He drank his own, his expression unchanging. He took the bottle and the cups to the hearth, and sat on his blanket. He motioned for her to take the chair. She did, huddling in the shawl, the warmth of the fire on her face and the warmth of the whiskey in her belly. "This is no life for you," he said quietly, staring into the flames. "It is my life now," she replied. "You were educated," he stated. "You are not like—" He stopped. Not like Anna. He did not have to say it. Anna was a woman who could build a cabin. Ruth was a woman who could keep a ledger. "I was taught to play the pianoforte," Ruth said, her voice soft. She looked down at her hands, at the calloused palms, the broken nails, the faint red scar from the burn. "I doubt I could play a single note now. It seems a foolish thing in a place like this." And a sound came out of her. It was a small, dry, scraping sound, like a rusty hinge moving for the first time in years. It was a laugh. It was a broken, dark, terrible sound, but it was real. It surprised her so much she stopped, her hand flying to her mouth. Elias turned. He was not looking at the fire anymore. He was looking at her. His gaze was intense, and it was different. He was not looking at the shadow of her past or the utility of her hands. He was seeing her, the woman in the chair, the woman who had laughed at her own broken life. "Come spring," he said, his voice low. "When the thaw comes and the trails are clear, you can go if you want it." He was offering her freedom. He was offering her an escape. "I will give you the train fare," he continued. "You can go somewhere else. Start over." Ruth thought about it. She pictured herself on another train platform, in another dusty town. Where would she go? What would she do? Back to Philadelphia, to be a pariah, a servant in her own family's circle, or to some city, to sell the only thing she had been told she was good for. She looked at the rough log walls of the cabin. She looked at the man by the fire, a man as hard and broken as the land itself, a man who still mourned the wife he had buried with his own hands. This place was cold. This man was silent, but he had bandaged her hand. He had punched a man for her. He had shared his whiskey with her. She looked at him, and she spoke the truest words she had ever said. "There is nowhere left for me." It was not an appeal for pity. It was a statement of fact, but in the small, warm cabin, it felt like a confession. It felt like a choice. "I am here. This is where I am." He held her gaze. The fire popped, a log settling. The wind moaned outside. He uncurled himself from the floor and rose, a shadow moving in the firelight. He stood before her chair. She did not flinch. She did not look away. He leaned down. It was slow, hesitant. He was breaking a vow. She was trusting a man. She could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the scar on his chin. His lips touched hers. It was not a kiss of passion. It was not the hungry, wet kiss of the artist in Philadelphia. It was hesitant. It was tender. It was chapped lips against chapped lips. It tasted of whiskey and wood smoke and the salt of the prairie. It was a question and an answer and a terror, all in one. It lasted only a moment. He broke it, pulling back quickly. He looked at her, his eyes wide, as if startled by his own action. They said nothing. Neither of them breathed. Elias turned, grabbed his heavy coat, and walked to the door. "I will check the animals," he said, his voice thick. He left. Ruth sat in the chair, her fingers pressed to her lips. She was trembling. The days that followed were a new kind of torture, a new kind of bliss. The routine did not change. They still rose. They still worked. They still spoke of the weather and the wood. But everything was different. It was in the small, silent gestures. When she passed him the tin of coffee, their fingers brushed. He did not pull away. His hand lingered for half a second, a warmth that shot up her arm. When she reported on the feed supply, he held her gaze for a second too long, and she felt a heat rise in her cheeks. She sat stitching a harness strap by the fire, her head bent in concentration. She looked up and found him watching her. Not the work, her hands, her face. He looked away, but not before she saw the hunger, and the sadness, and the confusion. A fragile, dangerous warmth began to grow in her heart. And with it came the fear. It was a cold, coiling sickness in her stomach. She knew this feeling. She had felt this before. The artist had been gentle. He had brought her flowers. He had praised her beauty. He had touched her hand, and his touch had promised a new, beautiful life. Elias was not gentle. He brought her wood, not flowers. He praised her stitching, not her beauty, but his touch, that brief, accidental brushing of hands, promised something just as dangerous. A home. She had been used. She had been fooled by kind gestures and soft words. What if this was the same? She began to fear the feelings growing in her heart. She started to watch him, her eyes sharp. Was this kindness? Was this the slow, patient unfolding of a man's heart? Or was this just a different, slower way of collecting on his $1 purchase? She had been a fool once, and it had cost her everything. She would not be a fool again. She began to pull back, building a new wall inside the one that had just started to crumble. She became quieter. She avoided his gaze. She made sure their hands did not touch. She was terrified of this new warmth, because she knew, better than anyone, how cold the world was when it was taken away. The uneasy quiet that had followed their kiss was a new kind of cold. It filled the cabin, heavier and more suffocating than the frost that now painted the inside of the window glass each morning. They still spoke of feed and weather, but the space between them was charged. Ruth felt his eyes on her when her back was turned, and she found herself watching his hands, remembering the hesitant, chapped lip pressure of his kiss. The fear in her heart was sharp. It was a cold, familiar stone, and it warned her that this man, with his quiet, steady presence, was more dangerous than the artist who had promised her everything. The artist had offered lies. Elias offered a fragile, terrifying truth, and she did not know if she could survive it. They needed supplies, a trip to Prosper that neither of them wanted to make. They rode in on the buckboard, the silence between them as vast as the prairie. The town was busier than usual. In the muddy, half-frozen street, a large tent had been erected, a banner, painted in crude, dripping letters, proclaimed, "The Lord's cleansing fire, Jedediah hail, repent, be saved." A traveling preacher, a small, loud man with a sweat-stained collar, was bellowing from a wooden box, his arms waving as he promised salvation and damnation in equal measure. Townsfolk were gathered, some listening with pious fervor, others with simple curiosity. Elias paid the man no mind. Pulling the wagon up to the general store, he climbed down. "Get what you need. I will load the oats." Ruth hurried inside, her head down, desperate to avoid notice. But the store was full, the air thick with the preacher's fervor. She was at the counter, waiting for the proprietor to measure out beans, when she felt a shadow fall over her. "Living in sin." The voice was low, sharp, and full of righteousness. Ruth turned. It was Mrs. Hames, the station master's wife, the woman who had spat at her feet. She was not alone. 2 other women, their faces pinched and hard, stood with her. "The good Reverend Hale is performing baptisms," Mrs. Hames continued, her voice loud enough for the entire store to hear, "and weddings, to make things proper in the eyes of God." Ruth froze, her blood turning to ice. "It is a disgrace to this town, Mr. Thorne." "Mrs. Hames said, looking past Ruth to Elias, who had just entered, a sack of flour on his shoulder. He did not pause, walking past the women to set the sack down. "Mrs. Hames's face reddened. "Did you hear me? We are a God-fearing community. That woman is a blight. You keep her in your home, unmarried. It is an abomination. You should make it proper." Elias turned slowly. His gray eyes were flat, cold as river stones. He looked at Mrs. Hames for a long, silent beat. The entire store held its breath. He said nothing. He simply turned back to the proprietor. "Add a barrel of salt to my order." The dismissal was more profound than any curse. "Mrs. Hames gasped, her face swelling with rage, but she did not dare confront him further. She and her companions gathered their skirts and swept out, muttering about heathens and whores. Ruth stood, trembling, unable to move. The word hung in the air. Wedding. The ride home was a torture. The word sat between them on the hard wagon seat, unspoken, heavy as an anvil. Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs. She kept thinking of the grave on the hill. Anna, beloved wife. They reached the cabin. They unloaded the supplies. The mules were tended. The fire was lit. The routine was their only shield against the tension. Ruth was stirring a pot of bean soup, her back to him. "That preacher," Elias said. Ruth flinched, her hand tightening on the wooden spoon. "He will be in Prosper for 2 more days." Elias continued, his voice low, directed at the fire. "He is, as the woman said, performing weddings." He paused, and the only sound was the bubbling of the soup. "The town will not stop," he said. "Their judgment is hard. A piece of paper, signed by a preacher. It would stop their tongues." He finally looked at her. His face was unreadable in the firelight. "If you want it," he said, "we can make it proper." The spoon slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the floor. "If you want it." He was giving her the choice. Her heart leaped. A name. His name. To be Mrs. Thorne. To not be the dollar bride. To be a wife. A respectable woman. To have a place. To have this man. This quiet, strong man. Bound to her. To belong. The desire for it was so sharp, so deep. It was a physical pain. But the fear was a cold hand on her throat. A wedding. A contract. A vow. It was a trap. It was a chain. Her uncle had sold her. A marriage certificate would be a deed of ownership. A final, unbreakable seal on the transaction. The artist had promised her freedom, and he had lied. Elias offered her a bond, and she was terrified it was just a different kind of cage. And what of Anna? Was she to be the replacement wife? A convenience to keep the house warm and the townsfolk quiet? She looked at the man who still wore his first wife's ring around his neck. The fear won. The fear was old and deep, and it had kept her alive. "No," she whispered. Her voice was so small he almost did not hear it. He waited, his gaze steady. I cannot," she said, her hands twisting in her apron. She could not explain it. She could not tell him that his offer of safety felt like the most dangerous thing in the world. Elias held her gaze for another moment. She saw something flicker in his eyes, not anger, but a deep, profound weariness. He had offered the only thing he could, and she had refused. He gave a single curt nod. "All right." He turned back to the fire, picked up a piece of harness, and began to oil it. He did not bring it up again. That night, Ruth went to her bed and curled into a tight, cold ball. She had been offered a home, and she had refused. She cried into her pillow, the silent, scalding tears of a person who has locked herself in her own prison. She cried for the life she wanted and was too broken to accept. Across the room, Elias sat by the dying embers long into the night. His hand closed around the ring on its leather cord. 2 weeks passed. The cold settled in, and the sky turned a permanent, heavy gray. A new, fragile truce held. They did not speak of the preacher. The kiss was a distant memory. The routine was everything. Elias had to ride to Prosper alone. An axle on the buckboard had cracked, and he needed the blacksmith. He left at dawn, leaving Ruth in the silent cabin. She was relieved. His presence was a constant, low-level ache in her chest. Alone. She could breathe. She scrubbed the floors, mended his shirts, and tried not to think. He returned at dusk, the air thick with the promise of snow. He walked in, stamping the cold from his boots. He had the part, he said, setting a heavy iron piece on the floor. He reached into his coat. The postmaster had this. It came by wire. He held out a folded yellow sheet, a telegram. Ruth's blood ran cold. No one in the world knew her name, except him, her uncle. Her hands shook so badly she could barely take the paper. She unfolded it. The black, blocky letters were stark. "It is from your uncle, William. Your sister Eliza is to be married. Bishop will officiate. Your presence is not requested. Do not attempt correspondence." The paper dropped from her numb fingers. Her sister, Eliza, the only person she had truly loved, the one she had practically raised, getting married, a bishop, a grand affair. And Ruth was not just uninvited. She was forbidden. She was a contagion, a stain, the finality of it, the cold, brutal severing of the last tie to her old life, hit her not as grief, but as a blinding, cold rage. She did not cry. She was beyond tears. She walked past Elias, who was watching her, his face grim. She did not bother with her shoes or her shawl. She pulled the cabin door open and walked out into the biting, twilight cold. The ground was frozen hard, the frost biting into the soles of her bare feet. She did not feel it. She walked to the burn barrel, the metal drum where they burned their trash. She fumbled in the tinder box kept nearby. Her fingers were stiff, clumsy. She struck a match. The flame flared. She picked up the telegram. She held the flame to the corner. The yellow paper curled, blackened, and caught fire. She watched the words, "Your sister, not requested. Do not attempt." Turn to gray ash and float away on the wind. She watched her past disintegrate. She stood there, barefoot in the frost, shaking. She was not shaking from the cold. She was shaking with a lifetime of compressed rage and shame. The cabin door opened. Elias was there. He had seen. He walked over to her, his heavy boots crunching on the frozen ground. He stood in front of her, blocking the wind. He did not ask what the letter said. He did not need to. He saw the ashes. He saw her face. He simply unbuttoned his heavy wool coat, the one that smelled of pine smoke and horses and him. He opened it wide and wrapped it around her, pulling her small, shaking body close. He wrapped her up, cocooning her in his warmth, his arms holding the coat closed around her. The solid, living warmth of him broke her. The cold, empty numbness shattered. She pressed her face against the rough flannel of his shirt, and a sound tore from her throat, a low, animal sound of pain. She is getting married," Ruth whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. "My sister." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes wild in the gathering dark. My uncle, he paid them a dowry, a fortune, to take her." The injustice of it, the cruelty, choked her. "He paid them to take her, and he sold me to you for $1. She looked at this hard, silent man, the man who had touched her burn with careful fingers, the man who had bled for her in town, the man who had offered her his name, and had accepted her refusal without anger. A sudden, sharp realization cut through her pain. "You," she whispered, her voice full of a strange, new awe. "The artist. He took my reputation, my uncle. He took my name, the town. They tried to take my dignity." She reached up, her cold hand touching his rough jaw. "You are the only man," she said, her voice breaking, "who never tried to take something from me." He looked down at her, and the mask of stone was gone. His eyes were full of a deep, aching sorrow, a grief she recognized. He saw her. He saw all the broken pieces. He did not speak. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not like the first time. There was no hesitation. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition. It was a kiss that said, "I am broken, too. I see you." He lifted her. She was light, small, lost in his coat. He carried her out of the cold, back into the cabin. He did put her down. He carried her to her bed, the bed he had given her on the first night. He laid her down gently, and for the first time, she did not flinch from him. He sat on the edge of the mattress, looking at her. He reached out and, with a clumsy, calloused finger, he traced the old, faded bruise on her cheek. He did not demand, he did not take, he waited. She gave him her answer. She reached up and, with trembling fingers, she untied the leather cord around his neck. She slid the cold, simple gold ring, Anna's ring, from it. She did not look at it. She pressed it into his palm and closed his fingers around it. She was not asking him to forget. She was asking him to see her. He understood. He set the ring on the small table beside her bed. That night, in the small, dark cabin, with the wind howling outside, they came together. It was not a violent act. It was a moment of shared vulnerability. It was a quiet, desperate release of all the loneliness, and the shame, and the grief they had both carried for so long. It was two people, souled and shattered, finding a moment of grace. It was a raw, human need for warmth and acceptance, a silent promise that they were not, in this one moment, alone in the vast, cold darkness. When Ruth awoke, the cabin was gray with the first light of dawn. She was alone in the bed. Panic, sharp and cold, seized her. He was gone. She had given him what he wanted, and he was gone. It was the artist all over again. The shame washed over her, so profound she felt sick. She lay there, rigid, listening. She heard him. He was outside, but he was not hitching the mules. He was working. There was a sound of sawing, and a soft, rhythmic tapping. She forced herself to rise, wrapping the wool shawl around her nakedness. Her body ached, but it was not a bad ache. She felt different, solid. She crept to the door and pulled it open a crack. The world was white. Snow was falling, thick, silent flakes. And on the small porch, kneeling in the snow, was Elias. He was working on the door, her cabin door. He was whistling, a low, tuneless sound, as he affixed a new, smoothly carved wooden latch to the inside of the door, a bar and hasp. She stared, uncomprehending. He saw her. He did not look ashamed. He did not look away. He gave her a small, shy nod. "What? What are you doing?" she whispered. He tested the new latch, sliding the heavy wooden bar into its socket. "This is for you," he said simply, not meeting her eye. "So you can lock it, from the inside." Ruth stared at the latch. He had spent the morning, after she had given him everything, building her a lock, to keep him out, to give her the choice. She leaned her head against the doorframe, and the tears that came were not of shame, or fear, or rage. They were tears of a deep, painful, overwhelming release. He was not a taker, he was a giver. The snow fell for 3 days. It buried the prairie, insulated the cabin, and cut them off from the world. And inside, something changed. Ruth was no longer a ghost. She was no longer a servant. She was a woman in her home. She prepared for the winter like she belonged. She boiled and cured the salt pork, hanging it from the rafters. She took the new calico and sewed herself a warm dress, and sewed Elias a new flannel-lined shirt. She baked bread, filling the cabin with a warm, yeasty smell. She moved with purpose. She was no longer waiting to be cast out. She was staying. Elias watched her. He would sit by the fire, mending a bridle, and his eyes would follow her as she moved about the cabin. His expression, usually so hard and unreadable, had softened. He watched her as if she were a strange, new creature he was only just beginning to understand. One afternoon, the snow had stopped. The world was bright, white, and silent. The cabin was warm, the stew bubbling on the stove. Elias was gone. She thought he was checking his trap lines, but when she went to the barn to fetch more wood, she found him. He was sitting on a low stool, the cold air smoking with his breath. He was carving. He held a large piece of pine, and he was using his knife to carefully, lovingly, shape it. She stepped closer. It was a cradle. It was small, simple, and sturdy. He was carving the rockers, his large, rough hands moving with impossible gentleness. Ruth stopped breathing. Her hand flew to her stomach. He looked up, caught. He was not embarrassed. He just held her gaze, the knife still in his hand. He said, his voice quiet, "In case someday." Ruth stared at the cradle, the symbol of Anna's death, the symbol of her own lost child, and now a symbol of a future. She was stunned. She was moved, and she was, all at once, terrified. She turned without a word and ran back to the house, her heart pounding. She leaned against the cabin wall, the snow falling from the roof onto her hair, gasping for breath. The hope he had just given her was the most frightening thing of all. The hope that had flickered between them was a fragile, unseasonable thing, and winter came to kill it. The mild snows of early December turned into a brutal, endless assault. The wind did not howl. It shrieked, a high, thin sound of madness that never stopped, day or night. The snow, which had been a soft, white blanket, became a landscape of iron-hard drifts, sculpted by the wind into cruel, sharp waves. The world shrank to the 4 log walls of the cabin, and the path, cleared daily, to the half-buried barn. Then the sickness came. It started with the chickens. Ruth found them one morning, huddled and still, their eyes closed. By nightfall, 2 were dead. A few days later, Elias's best horse, a strong bay gelding, refused to eat. Its breathing grew shallow and ragged. They fought it together. They spent days in the freezing barn, a place that was now colder than the open prairie. They boiled water and herbs, forcing warm mashes down the animals' throats. Elias sat all night with the gelding, rubbing its legs, speaking to it in a low, rough voice that Ruth had never heard him use with a person. It was not enough. They lost the gelding, and then they lost a mare, a gentle chestnut that Ruth had just begun to feed by hand. They dragged the bodies out and left them for the coyotes. The ground was too hard to bury them. The loss was a physical blow, a theft of the future Elias had been trying to build, of the cradle he had carved. He stood by the empty stalls, his face a mask of cold, hard grief. "It is the lung fever," he said, his voice flat. "It is in the air, in the feed, the mules. If the mules get it—" He did not have to finish. The mules were their life, their only way to haul wood, to get to town, to survive. "There is a tonic," he said, pulling on his heavy coat. "In Prosper, a man at the feed store makes it. I have to go." Ruth's heart seized. "In this, you cannot. The trail is gone. You will freeze before you get halfway." "The mules will die if I do not," he said simply. He took his rifle. "I will be back by morning." "Elias," she said, grabbing his arm. It was the first time she had held him back. "Please." He looked at her hand on his sleeve. He covered it with his own gloved hand for just a second. "Lock the door," he said. "Do not open it until you hear me." He left. Ruth was alone. She had never been so alone. The silence of the cabin was deafening. The wind was a living, malicious thing, scratching at the door, pushing against the windows. She kept the fire roaring. She sat in the chair, her hands clenched, and watched the night come. Every gust of wind was a new terror. She imagined him lost in the whiteout, his horse fallen, the cold seeping in. She thought of Anna, dying in a storm. She did not sleep. She sat all night, her body rigid, listening. The first gray light of dawn was just touching the snow when she heard it. Not the sound of the wagon, but a single horse, stumbling, exhausted. She ran to the door, her hands fumbling with the new bar he had built for her. She threw it open. Elias was slumped over the saddle of his remaining horse. He was not riding. He was clinging. He slid from the saddle, caught himself on the door frame, and half fell into the cabin. He was bloodied. His lip was split, a raw, dark cut. His left eye was swollen shut, the skin around it a dark, ugly purple. His knuckles, the ones that had healed from the fight in town, were torn open again, raw and bleeding into the snow. "Elias!" she shrieked. "The medicine," he gasped. A small sack was tied to his belt. He tore it off and threw it on the table. "For the mules." He collapsed into the chair by the fire, his body trembling with cold and exhaustion. Ruth flew into motion. She barred the door, her terror replaced by a cold, sharp rage. She ripped a clean cloth, dipped it in the water bucket, it was already filmed with ice, and knelt before him.
"Who did this?"
she demanded, her voice shaking. She pressed the cloth to his split lip. He hissed in pain, but did not pull away. "On the trail, back from Prosper. 3 of them. Not from town?" "No," he said, his breathing ragged. "They were waiting for me. On the ridge." He looked up at her, his one good eye clear and sharp. "They were not after the medicine, Ruth. They were after you." The cloth fell from her hand. "What?" "One of them, he did the talking," Elias said, wincing as he shifted. "A man with a smooth voice, soft hands, called himself Ambrose." Ruth stared, the name meaning nothing and everything. The artist, his name was Ambrose Scott. "He said I had his property." Elias continued, his voice low and dangerous. "He had papers, signed by your uncle. A contract." Ruth's blood turned to water. She sat back on her heels, her mind reeling. Her uncle had done this. He had not just sold her to Elias, he had sold her, or promised her, to Ambrose first. A forged paper, a lie, a way to give the artist a claim, to ensure he would come and take her away, to wash the stain of her completely from the family name. She had not just been cast out, she had been hunted. He said, Elias spat a drop of blood onto the floor. He said $1 was not a binding price. He said he had come to collect what was his. What did you say?" "I told him you were not property." Elias said. "He laughed. So I hit him. The other 2, they had clubs. He had fought them. 3 of them. For her. He had been beaten, left for dead in the snow, and he had still crawled back here with the medicine." Ruth looked at his battered face, at the blood on the floor. She saw the cradle in the corner. She saw the grave on the hill. This was her fault. The whispers in town were one thing. This was violence. This was blood. She was a curse. She had brought her filth, her past, to this quiet man's door, and it was going to kill him. "I will protect you," Elias said, seeing the look on her face. "They will come back, but I will be ready." His words of protection were a death sentence. She looked at him, at this good, quiet man who had shown her nothing but a hard, careful kindness, and she saw him dead. She saw him in the snow, or shot down in his own doorway. All for her, for the $1 bride. She stood up, her body numb. "You need to rest," she said, her voice flat. I will tend the mules." She took the medicine and fled to the barn. She forced the tonic down the animals' throats, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the bottle. She was not healing them. She was poisoning them. She was the sickness. She stayed in the barn all day, pretending to work, her mind a screaming void. She could not stay. She could not be the reason he died. She could not be the cause of another grave on that hill. That night, the cabin was a tomb. Elias lay on his blanket by the fire, his breathing heavy, his new rifle resting against the wall, loaded. Ruth lay on her bed, rigid, staring into the darkness. She waited. She waited until the rhythm of his breathing told her he was finally asleep, dragged under by pain and exhaustion. Quiet as a shadow, she slid from the bed. She gathered her few things, the new calico dress he had bought her, her old, ruined traveling suit. She folded them and placed them in the battered carpet bag she had arrived with. She put on her boots. She wrapped Anna's shawl around her shoulders. She would not take his coat. She would take nothing that was his. She stood by the door, her hand on the new wooden bar. A choice. He had given her a choice, and she was choosing to leave, to save him from herself. Ruth. His voice, low and thick, cut through the darkness. She froze. He was sitting up, a dark shape against the dying fire. "Do not," he said. It was not a command. It was a plea. "I have to," she whispered, her back to him. "Did you not see your face? Did you not feel their clubs? They will come back. Elias, they will come back, and they will kill you." "Let them try," he said, standing up. He was unsteady, but he was on his feet. "For what?" she cried, whirling on him. "For me? For a ruined woman your uncle paid them to take? For $1? "It is not about the dollar," he said, taking a step toward her, his hand out. "Ruth, stay." "No!" she screamed, the word tearing out of her, all the terror and shame of a lifetime erupting. "I will not. I will not be the one who puts you in the ground. I will not have you die for me." She pointed, her hands shaking, toward the window, toward the hill she could not see. "I am not worth another grave." The words hit him like a physical blow. He flinched, his face twisting in a pain that had nothing to do with his bruises. He had spoken of Anna, but she had just thrown his wife's ghost between them. It is not the same," he choked out. "It is," she yelled, tears streaming down her face. "She died because you were here, alone. I will not be the reason you die, too. I am a curse." As they argued, the wind, which had been a low moan, suddenly rose to a violent, high-pitched shriek. A blizzard, a new one, slammed into the cabin, a wall of wind and ice. The cabin groaned. "You cannot go in this," he said, his voice raw. "You will die." "It is better than you dying," she screamed. She grabbed the door bar, ripped it from its socket, and threw the door open. The storm exploded into the room, a chaos of snow and wind, extinguishing the lamp, sending embers flying from the fire. "Ruth," he roared. She ran out into the night, into the blinding, freezing white. She did not know where she was going. She was just running, from him, from Ambrose, from her past. "Ruth, come back!" She heard him roar her name behind her, a sound swallowed by the storm. She just ran, stumbling through the drifts, the wind stealing her breath, the ice cutting at her face. He followed. He did not even stop for his coat. He plunged into the white darkness after her, following the dark. Frantic impressions her feet were making in the snow. Ruth. She could not hear him. She could barely see. The snow was a moving wall. The cold was a physical weight, crushing her. Her lungs burned. Her legs were heavy, her boots filling with snow. She fell, scrambled up, and fell again. She was not dressed for this. The shawl was ripped from her grasp by the wind. The cold was immediate, 1,000 knives in her skin. She collapsed. She fell face first into a drift. And she did not have the strength to get up. The pain was fading, replaced by a strange, peaceful numbness. It was warm. It was quiet. It was easy. She could just sleep. A hand, hard and rough, closed on her shoulder. She was yanked up, turned over. Elias was there, a demon in the storm, his face a mask of snow and terror. He was not wearing a coat. "No!" she sobbed, weakly, trying to push him away. "Let me go! Let me—" He did not speak. He threw her over his shoulder like a sack of feed. His arm clamped around her legs and began to walk. He fought the storm, his head down, one agonizing step at a time, following their own tracks back toward the faint, orange square of the cabin light. He half fell through the doorway, throwing her onto the floor by the hearth. He slammed the door against the wind and dropped the bar into place. The cabin was in chaos. Snow covered the floor. The fire was almost out. He ignored it. He was on his knees beside her. She was shivering, her lips blue, her eyes rolling back. "No, you do not," he growled, his voice a guttural command. He ripped the wet, frozen dress from her body, chafing her limbs with a rough blanket, his movements frantic, desperate. He piled every blanket in the cabin on top of her. He stoked the fire, throwing wood on recklessly until it roared to life. He knelt by her, rubbing her frozen hands between his own, his battered face inches from hers. You do not get to die, he panted. You do not get to choose that. I choose. I choose. She was coming back, the numbness replaced by a bone-deep, agonizing pain as her blood thawed. She was sobbing, great, racking shudders.
It is my fault,
she whispered, her teeth chattering.
I am just sold.
Listen to me, he said, his hands gripping her shoulders. Let me choose you. He saw the confusion in her eyes. I am not asking for your past, he said, his voice raw, desperate. I do not care about that man. I do not care about your uncle. I am asking for your now. I am asking for you. Ruth, just you, here, with me. Let me choose you. She looked at him, at his beaten face, at the desperation in his one good eye.
I want to be chosen,
she whispered, the confession tearing from her.
Not bought. He bought me. Ambrose. And you.
You bought me. For $1. I am just the dollar woman. It was the final ghost, the root of all her shame. Elias understood. The word, the transaction. He stood up, his body aching. He went to his small lockbox by his bed. He fumbled with the key, his bruised fingers stiff. He opened it. He came back and knelt beside her in the blankets. He held out his closed fist. Then finish it, he said. He opened his hand. In his palm, dark and heavy, was a single, tarnished silver dollar. Take it, he commanded. Her hand, still blue and shaking, crept out. She stared at the coin, the price of her shame, the symbol of her worthlessness. Take it. Her fingers closed around it. It was cold as ice. It is yours, he said, his voice thick. It was never mine. It was the price of your passage, nothing more. Now, if you want this, if you want me, give it back. She stared at the coin. Give it back. A choice. A new transaction. Not a purchase, a trade. Her fingers, stiff and clumsy, opened. She held the coin out to him. Give it back, Ruth, he whispered. Choose me. Her hand trembled. She pushed the coin into his palm. He closed his fist around it, and the transaction was done. She was not bought. She was chosen. He did not move. He knelt there, his fist clenched, as she lay shivering under the pile of blankets. The storm raged on outside, a wild, screaming animal trying to tear the cabin from the earth, but inside, by the roaring fire, two people held on. The wind was cold, but the fire between them, born of grief and shame and a new, terrible hope, held strong. The winter did not surrender. It fought, clinging to the land, releasing its grip with a groan. The thaw was not a gentle melting. It was a violent breaking. Ice dams on the creek burst, sending gray, churning water over the low-lying fields. The snow receded, not into water, but into thick, clinging, boot-stealing mud. The world was brown and raw, a wound scrubbed clean. But then, life returned. It came first as a sound, the drip of water from the eaves, the crackle of the creek, the distant call of a meadowlark. Then, almost overnight, a fragile, impossible green pushed through the mud. The brown hillsides were suddenly stained with color. First, the pale purple of the prairie crocus, then the bright, defiant yellow of buttercups. The air, once sharp and sterile, now smelled of damp earth, of new grass, of life. The ranch, which had been a frozen, silent tomb, breathed again. And in the cabin, two people breathed with it. The storm that had nearly killed them had broken the final barrier. The shame and the ghosts that had lived between them were scoured away, leaving an empty space they now had to fill. They began to rebuild, not as a master and a servant, but as partners. The work was endless. The winter had been hard on the cabin, hard on the barn. They worked from the first gray light until the last purple dusk. They moved as a team, a quiet, efficient unit. "The south fence is down," Elias would say. "I will fetch the wire." Ruth would reply. They spent days riding the property line, he setting the new posts with a heavy maul, she stretching and tying the wire, her chapped hands quick and sure. She was no longer just a housekeeper. She was part of the land. She learned the feel of it, the smell of it. She learned to read the sky, to feel the shift in the wind. Elias, in turn, began to share his world. He taught her. He showed her which plants were medicine and which were poison. He showed her how to track, how to read the small, scattered signs of deer and rabbit. He was still a man of few words, but his silence was no longer an absence. It was a comfortable space they shared. They planted crops, not just a small kitchen garden, but a real field. Elias drove the plow, cutting deep, dark furrows in the earth. Ruth followed behind, dropping the seed, corn, beans, and potatoes. Her back ached, her hands were raw, but she had never felt such a profound, grounding satisfaction. She was not just tending a house, she was building a future. "We need cattle," Elias said one evening, looking over the ledger she kept. The pages were filling up. "The land is good. The grass is rich. We could run a small herd." Ruth looked up, her eyes shining. "Cattle," she said. It was a word of permanence, a word of wealth, a word of home. They began to plan. They saved. They worked. One afternoon in late April, when the sky was a high, clear blue and the world was alive, Elias stopped his work. He was mending the barn roof, and she was below, handing him the shingles. He looked down at her. The sun was in her hair, turning it a shade of brown he had never noticed. Her face was no longer pale and bruised, but tanned by the wind, strong. "Come," he said. He led her not to the hill where Anna lay, but to the creek, to a place where a single, ancient cottonwood tree grew. It was the oldest living thing on their land, its new leaves a bright, shimmering green in the sunlight. He stood before her, his hat in his hands. He was clean, wearing the new shirt she had sewn for him. "I have no ring to give you," he said, his voice low and rough. Ruth smiled. She reached up and touched the leather cord around his neck, the one that no longer held a ring. "I do not need one," she said. "I cannot take you to a church," he continued, "and the preacher is long gone." "This is our church," she said, looking up at the high branches, at the blue sky beyond. He nodded. He took her hands. His were hard and calloused. Hers were the same. They fit together. "I, Elias Thorne," he said, his gray eyes locked on hers, his voice thick. "Take you, Ruth, to be my wife, to build with, to protect, to choose, every day." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. "Ruth," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Take you, Elias, to be my husband, to stand with, to work beside, to choose, always." He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a kiss of grief or of release. It was a kiss of promise. It was slow and deep and rooted, like the tree above them. They were married, just the two of them, beneath a cottonwood tree, with the prairie wind as their witness. Life settled into a new rhythm, the rhythm of a shared life. They went to Prosper for supplies, not as a man and his shameful burden, but as a man and his wife. They rode on the wagon seat, their shoulders brushing. The townsfolk still whispered. The name Dollar Bride still clung to her, a faint, sour smell. But something had changed. Ruth walked taller. She did not hide her face. She did not drop her gaze. When she walked into the general store, she met the hard, curious stares with a quiet dignity. She was Mrs. Thorne. This was her town, this was her home, and she would not be shamed in it. The whispers began to falter, to be replaced by a grudging silence. The turning point came in the heat of early summer. They were in town, negotiating the purchase of their first 2 cows from a local farmer. The square was dusty, the air thick and still. A scream cut through the heavy air. It was a woman's shriek, pure terror. Ruth and Elias turned. Mrs. Hames, the station master's wife, was standing frozen by the feed store, her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Her young grandson, a boy of about 6, was on the ground, clutching his leg, writhing.
"A snake!"
Someone yelled.
"He is bit! A rattler!"
The town square erupted in panic. Men ran over, but no one knew what to do. The boy was already turning a pale, sickly gray, his cries weakening to whimpers.
"Get the doctor."
"Doctor is out at the Miller farm. Will not be back till nightfall."
"He is dying, Mrs."
Hames wailed, collapsing on the boardwalk. Ruth moved. She did not think. She ran. She pushed through the circle of helpless men and knelt beside the boy. She saw it, 2 small, dark punctures on his ankle, the flesh around it already swelling and turning a dark, mottled purple.
"Hold him down,"
she commanded, her voice so sharp and clear that 2 of the men instantly obeyed, pinning the boy's shoulders. She pulled a small knife from the sheath Elias always kept on the wagon. Before anyone could protest, she made 2 small, quick cuts over the bite marks. She ignored the boy's thin scream. She bent her head and put her mouth to the wound.
"Good Lord, woman, what are you doing?"
one of the men gasped. She spat a mouthful of blood and venom into the dust. She did it again and again.
"Elias,"
she ordered, not looking up.
"In my mending bag, the small tin, and a strip of cloth. Now."
Elias was already there, pressing the items into her hand. She ripped open the tin. It was a dark, pungent poultice she had made herself, from the plants Elias had shown her, plantain and echinacea. She packed the thick green paste onto the wound and bound it tightly with the cloth.
"Water,"
she snapped. Someone handed her a canteen. She lifted the boy's head.
"Drink,"
she said, her voice softening. "You must drink. You will be all right. You are strong." She sat in the dust of the main street, holding the boy, forcing water into him. For nearly an hour, the town stood and watched. Finally, the boy's color began to return. His breathing eased. He stopped shaking and fell into a weak, exhausted sleep. Ruth looked up at Mrs. Hames, who was staring at her, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning, terrible shame. Ruth gently handed the sleeping boy to one of the men. "Keep him cool and make him drink. He will be sick for a few days, but he will live." She stood, wiped her mouth on her sleeve, and walked back to Elias, who was waiting by the wagon. He said nothing, but his one good eye was full of a fierce, burning pride. He handed her the canteen, and she rinsed her mouth, spitting the last of the poison into the dust. They finished their business and drove home in silence. The next Sunday, a wagon came up the track to their cabin. It was Mr. Hames. He was alone. He sat stiffly on his wagon seat, holding a small wooden crate. Ruth and Elias came out onto the porch. Mr. Hames did not get down. He would not meet their eyes. He cleared his throat.
"The boy, he is fine,"
he said, his voice rough.
"The doctor said you saved his life, said what you did was right."
He reached down and placed the crate on the edge of the porch.
"The wife, she sent this."
Inside were 3 laying hens and a jar of plum preserves. Ruth nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Hames. Tell your wife we are grateful." He just nodded, clicked to his horse, and drove away. The rumors did not stop. Not completely, but they no longer had any power. Ruth was no longer the dollar bride. She was the woman who had faced down a rattlesnake. She was Mrs. Thorne, and she had earned her name. Their life took on a quiet, steady glow. They bought the cattle. The ranch began to feel like a real ranch. The cabin, once so cold and empty, was now a home. It smelled of baking bread, of drying herbs, of him. But as the days grew shorter, as their first full summer as man and wife began to fade, a new fear began to grow in Ruth's heart. The cradle. Elias had finished it. It sat in the corner of the cabin, a beautiful, simple piece of craftsmanship. It was a promise. It was a symbol of the future they were building. And it was empty. Ruth began to count the days. She began to watch her body with a growing, cold dread. The artist had left her with more than just a ruined name. The sickness, the lost pregnancy. It had left a scar inside her. One night, as they sat by the fire, she could not hold it in any longer. "Elias," she said, her voice so quiet he barely heard her. He looked up from the bridle he was mending. "The cradle is beautiful," she whispered. "But it may be that I cannot—" He set his work down. "Cannot what, Ruth?" "I may never bear children," she said, the words tasting like ash. "From before, when I was sick, I think I am barren, damaged." She was offering him her final, most secret shame. She was not just a ruined woman. She was a barren wife. In this world, that was the final failure. Elias looked at her, his face soft in the firelight. He came and knelt before her chair. He took her hands. "I did not marry you for children," he said, his voice steady. "I married you for you." He was silent for a moment. Then he gave her a small, rough smile. "We lost the horses, but the land is still good. We lost Anna, but the house is still strong." He squeezed her hands. "Then we will fill the house with whatever love we can." Ruth looked at him, and the love she felt for this hard, quiet, gentle man was so big it threatened to break her heart all over again, but in a good way. A few weeks later, they had to go to Prosper. They were trading pelts for winter supplies. As they were loading the wagon, Elias heard a piece of news from the feed store owner. "Sad business," the man said, shaking his head. "That woman who did the laundry, Mary, down by the creek, died this morning. Fever, left a babe, no family." "What will happen to the child?" Ruth asked, her heart stopping. "Orphanage, I suppose." The man shrugged. "Or the preacher will find someone to take it, if it survives. It is a burden." Elias and Ruth looked at each other. They did not need to speak. They walked to the small shack by the creek. The town doctor was just leaving, his face grim. "There is nothing to be done for her," he said. "The babe is inside. Healthy for now." They went in. The room was cold, poorer even than their cabin had been. On a thin, dirty mattress, a tiny, red-faced infant was wrapped in a threadbare cloth, wailing a thin, hungry cry. Ruth walked over and lifted the child. It was a girl, only a few days old. She was so small. Ruth held the baby to her chest, and the crying, miraculously, stopped. The baby turned, rooting, seeking warmth. Elias came and stood behind her. He put his large, calloused hand on the baby's head. "She is ours," Ruth whispered. "Yes," Elias said. They took her home. They did not ask permission. They did not sign any papers. They just took her. They brought her into the warm cabin. Ruth gently bathed the child in a warm basin, washing away the smell of sickness and death. She wrapped her in a clean piece of flannel, cut from one of her old nightgowns. She looked at the child, at this small, perfect creature, this new life born from sorrow. "Her name," Ruth said, her voice thick with tears, "is Hope." Elias nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Ruth carried the baby to the corner and, with a trembling breath, she laid her down in the wooden cradle. It was no longer empty. That night, the baby cried. Elias, not Ruth, got up. He went to the cradle. He who had lost his firstborn in this very room. He whose hands were made for plows and rifles. He picked up the tiny infant. He held her against his broad chest, his hand covering her entire back. He began to rock her, humming a low, tuneless song, a sound as rough and steady as the prairie wind. Ruth sat up in bed, watching them by the firelight. She watched this man, her husband, rocking another woman's child in the cradle he had built. He was giving this orphan his love, his name, his home, without question. The tears she had held back finally came. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the shame, the fear, the cold. She thought of the dollar coin that had defined her, that he had kept, locked in his box, a symbol of their new beginning. She whispered into the warm darkness, her voice thick with a love so profound it ached. "You paid $1, but you gave me everything." The story ends not in that cabin, but months later, on the ridge, not the ridge of the dead, but the one that overlooked their land. The sun was setting, painting the vast, empty sky in colors of fire and gold. Elias stood, hope bundled securely on his chest. Ruth stood beside him, her hand linked in his. The wind was cold, as it always was. The prairie was wild, as it would always be. It was a hard, unforgiving land, a land that did not promise ease. But Ruth looked at her husband, at her daughter, at the small curl of smoke rising from their cabin chimney, and the home in Ruth's heart, the one that had been sold, and broken, and abandoned, was finally warm, fierce, and unbreakable. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so you can connect with fellow listeners. Please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.